I'm David Miller, 32, a single dad of two after my wife left us 3 years ago for her fresh start. Since then, I've been juggling 2 jobs, sleepless nights, and constant judgment from everyone, especially my former mother-in-law Patricia, who still considers herself the authority on my children's lives. Last Tuesday, she cornered me at school pickup and declared loudly enough for other parents to hear that I was completely clueless about parenting and that my kids would be better off with someone who actually knows what they're doing. The shame burned through me as other parents stared and whispered, "But what?" Patricia didn't know was that I had just been elected PTA president by the biggest margin in school history. What she also didn't know was that I'd been quietly building a case that would expose her years of manipulation and her attempts to undermine my relationship with my own children. The moment had finally come to show everyone, including myself, what this clueless dad was really capable of. I still remember the day my world collapsed. 3 years ago, I came home from my second job at the hardware store to find Jessica sitting at our kitchen table with divorce papers spread out like a fan. She wouldn't look at me directly, just kept fidgeting with her wedding ring. "I need my fresh start, David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm suffocating here." What I didn't understand then was that Patricia had been in her ear for months, feeding her doubts about our marriage, our finances, our future. Patricia had a way of making observations that sounded like caring concern but cut like surgical knives. "You're so young, sweetheart. Are you sure this is the life you want?" she'd ask Jessica during their weekly coffee dates. The divorce papers were thorough. Patricia had helped Jessica find the lawyer, had even co-signed the retainer fee. I learned later that she'd been the one to suggest Jessica ask for primary custody. Even though Jessica had never shown much interest in the day-to-day parenting, Patricia convinced her it was what mothers do, that I wouldn't fight for the children anyway. But Jessica surprised everyone, including Patricia. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, she announced she was moving to California with her new boyfriend, a guy she'd met online, who promised her adventure and freedom. She signed over full custody to me without a fight, leaving Patricia stunned and me overwhelmed. Those first months were brutal. Emma was 5 and Jake was 3, and they couldn't understand why Mummy wasn't coming home. I'd find Emma sitting by the window at dinner time, watching for Jessica's car. Jake would ask every night if Mommy was coming to read him a story. I was working 2 jobs just to keep our heads above water. The morning shift at the auto parts store, then rushing home to get the kids' lunch before heading to my afternoon job. At Mitchell's Hardware, Patricia would show up unannounced, claiming she was just checking on the children, but really she was documenting every sign of struggle. Every toy left on the floor, every dinner that came from a box. Every time I fell asleep on the couch while helping Emma with homework. "You're drowning, David," she'd say, shaking her head with practiced concern. "These children need stability. They need proper care." What she meant was they needed her care, her control, her version of what a proper family should look like. She'd already taken over my marriage. Now she wanted my children too. The first time I walked into a PTA meeting, I felt like an intruder. It was Emma's second year at Roosevelt Elementary, and I'd been getting notices about meetings for months, but never had the courage to attend. Single dads weren't exactly common in our suburban neighborhood, and I'd grown used to being the only father at school events. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, had gently suggested I might want to get involved. "Emma mentions you help her with her homework every night," she'd said during our parent-teacher conference. "She talks about how you make up math songs to help her remember multiplication tables. The PTA could use someone who understands what kids actually need." So there I was, standing in the back of the school cafeteria with a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching 25 parents discuss fundraising strategies and playground equipment. I pulled out a small notebook, a habit I'd developed from my job at the hardware store, where keeping track of inventory and customer requests was essential. The meeting was supposed to start at 7, but parents kept filtering in late, apologizing for traffic or babysitter issues. I recognized some faces from pickup lines and school events, but most of these parents seemed to know each other well. They had an easy familiarity that made me feel even more like an outsider. The current PT president, Mrs. Hoffman, was clearly overwhelmed. She kept shuffling papers and losing her place in the agenda. When she announced they still needed volunteers for the fall festival, the room grew uncomfortably quiet. I found myself taking notes about what wasn't being said, the gaps in communication, the lack of follow-through on previous commitments, the way certain parents dominated conversations while others sat silent. "We really need someone to coordinate with the custodial staff about setup," Mrs. Hoffman said, looking around the room hopefully, "and someone who understands logistics." I cleared my throat. I could help with that. The room turned to look at me, and I felt my face flush. I mean, I work in retail, so I understand scheduling and coordination, and I've done some event planning. This was partially true. I'd helped organize customer appreciation events at the hardware store, though nothing on the scale of a school festival. But I'd learned that sometimes you had to stretch the truth about your capabilities until you grew into them. Mrs. Hoffman looked relieved. "That would be wonderful, Mr. Miller, David Miller. Emma's in Mrs. Rodriguez's class, and Jake's in kindergarten with Mrs. Patterson." After the meeting, a few parents approached me. Sarah Chen, mother of twin boys, smiled warmly. I'm glad to see another working parent here. Sometimes these meetings feel like they're designed for people who don't have day jobs. Walking to my car, I realized I'd filled 3 pages of notes not just about the meeting agenda, but about the dynamics, the personalities, the undercurrents of frustration, and unmet needs. For the first time in months, I felt like I might have something valuable to contribute. When I got home, Patricia was sitting on my front porch. "How was your little meeting?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "I hope you're not overcommitting yourself. These children need their father present, not running around playing politics." I looked at her sitting there, in judgment, and something shifted inside me. "The children need their father engaged in their education and their community," I said quietly. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Her eyes narrowed, but I was already unlocking my door, already planning my next moves. Emma's drawing was taped to our refrigerator right next to Jake's finger painting of what he called Daddy's truck. In Emma's picture, I was standing behind a counter with tools hanging on the wall, but she'd drawn me with a huge smile and the word helper in crayon letters above my head, that it was her assignment for Community Workers Week. And when I asked her why she chose to draw me at the hardware store instead of something more exciting like a firefighter or astronaut, she looked at me like I'd asked the most obvious question in the world. "Because you help people every day, Daddy. Mrs. Henderson came in crying about her broken sink, and you fixed it, and you helped Mr. Garcia find the right screws for his fence, and you always know where everything is." Children see things differently than adults. They don't see the bills scattered across the kitchen table, or the dark circles under my eyes from another sleepless night. They see their father making pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse on Saturday mornings, even when we're eating cereal for dinner on Tuesday nights. Jake, at 6, had developed a habit of patting my shoulder when I looked stressed. "It's okay, Daddy," he'd say in his serious little voice. "We're a good team." But they also absorbed the tension that Patricia brought into our lives. I'd catch Emma's face changing when Patricia walked into a room, her natural enthusiasm dampening into careful politeness. Jake would become clingy after Patricia's visits, asking questions like, "Are you going to leave like Mommy did?" Or "Why does Grandma Patricia look sad when she sees us?" The bedtime routine had become our sacred time. After homework, dinner, and baths, we'd pile onto my bed and read together. Emma was reading chapter books now, sounding out harder words with determination. Jake preferred picture books, but he'd sit quietly through Emma's selections, occasionally asking questions about plot points he didn't understand. "Daddy," Emma said one night as I was tucking her in, "why does Grandma Patricia always say you're doing things wrong?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "She tells Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store that you don't know how to braid my hair right, but I like how you do it. And she told Aunt Marie that you feed us too much fast food, but we only had McDonald's twice, and it was because you were working late." I sat down on the edge of her bed, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes adults disagree about the best way to do things, but you and Jake are healthy and happy, and that's what matters most." "Are we happy?" she asked, and the question was so earnest it broke my heart. "Are you happy?" I asked back. She considered this seriously. "I'm happy when we're together. I'm happy when you help with my math homework and don't get frustrated when I don't understand. I'm happy when you make those funny voices reading Jake's books." "Then yes, we're happy," I said. "We're different from other families, but we're happy." Jake appeared in the doorway, dragging his stuffed elephant. "I had a bad dream," he whispered. I scooped him up and we all ended up in my bed. Jake curled against my side and Emma, reading aloud from her current book. These moments, messy, imperfect, real, were what Patricia couldn't understand. She saw chaos where we had found our rhythm, saw inadequacy where we had built resilience. The next morning, I found Emma in the kitchen before school, carefully packing an extra juice box in her backpack. "What's that for?" I asked. "Tommy Lou forgot his lunch yesterday and looked really sad. I want to make sure he has something to drink if it happens again." That's when I knew that despite all of Patricia's criticism, despite all my fears about whether I was enough, my children were learning empathy, kindness, and community care. They were learning to notice when others needed help and to offer it freely. Patricia could criticize my parenting methods all she wanted, but she couldn't argue with the results. The text messages started showing up on my phone 3 months after I joined the PTA, screenshots forwarded by my sister Lisa, who was still in the family group chat Patricia had created after Jessica left. "Just worried about those poor children," Patricia had written to the group. "David means well, but he's clearly overwhelmed. Emma's hair looks like it hasn't been brushed in days, and Jake is so clingy. Children need stability, not a father who's playing catch-up." Lisa had been receiving these messages for months. She admitted when she finally called me, "I didn't know how to tell you. She's been building a case, I guess, against you." The messages were carefully crafted, concerned grandmother worried about her grandchildren's welfare. Patricia had mastered the art of plausible deniability, couching her attacks in language that sounded caring but was designed to plant seeds of doubt. "I stopped by to check on them yesterday." Read another message. "David was at work, of course, and the babysitter was letting them watch television while she talked on the phone. I had to practically force Emma to do her homework. The poor thing seems to be raising herself. This was about Mrs. Kim, the retired teacher who watched Emma and Jake after school. Mrs. Kim was a godsend, vacation, kind, and absolutely devoted to helping both kids with their homework. Patricia had twisted a moment of earned screen time into evidence of neglect. But the messages weren't just going to family members. I learned from another PTA parent that Patricia had been making the rounds at church, at the grocery store, at the coffee shop downtown. Always the same approach: concern, careful documentation, subtle suggestions that maybe someone should intervene. She came up to me at the post office, Mrs. Chen told me after a PTA meeting, started asking about Emma's behavior at birthday parties, whether I'd noticed her seeming tired or stressed. I told her Emma was one of the most well-adjusted kids. I knew, but she kept pressing. Patricia had even reached out to Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, requesting a meeting to discuss Emma's concerning behavior patterns. Mrs. Rodriguez had politely declined, noting that Emma was performing well academically and socially, but Patricia had persisted. She wanted to know if Emma ever mentioned being hungry, or having trouble sleeping, or missing her mother, Mrs. Rodriguez told me during a parent conference. I assured her that Emma talks about you with pride and affection, but I wanted you to know about the conversation. The most disturbing message Lisa shared was from just last week. I've been researching custody modification procedures. Did you know that courts prioritize the best interests of the children over biological relationships? Sometimes loving grandparents have to step in when parents are struggling. Patricia wasn't just criticizing my parenting, she was actively working to take my children away from me. The realization made my hands shake as I held my phone. This wasn't about concern for Emma and Jake. This was about control, about Patricia's need to manage and manipulate every situation to her satisfaction. She'd lost control when Jessica left, and she'd been systematically working to regain it through my children ever since. That night, after Emma and Jake were asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing down everything I could remember. Every unexpected visit, every critical comment, every time Patricia had overstepped her boundaries, every time she'd contradicted my parenting decisions in front of the children, or made them feel guilty for loving their father. List was longer than I'd expected. 3 years of documented manipulation, criticism, and interference. 3 years of a woman who couldn't accept that her daughter had made her own choices, and who was now determined to undo the consequences of those choices by any means necessary. I pulled out my phone and started a new note. Patricia, documentation. If she was building a case against me, I needed to build a case of my own. The difference was, my case would be based on truth, not manipulation. The next morning, I changed. The locks on my house, the composition notebook cost me $2 at the dollar store, but it became my most valuable possession. Every morning before work, I'd write down the previous day's events, not just the big confrontations, but the small moments that revealed Patricia's pattern of behavior. March 15th, I wrote, Patricia arrived at 3:30 p.m. without calling, used her key need to change locks, told Emma her ponytail was sloppy, and redid it while I was helping Jake with homework. When I asked her to call before coming over, she said she was just being a helpful grandmother. Emma asked me later why her hair wasn't good enough. The notebook entries revealed a pattern I hadn't fully recognized before. Patricia's visits always increased when things were going well for us. When Emma brought home an A on her spelling test, Patricia would show up to point out that Emma's handwriting needed work. When Jake successfully rode his bike without training wheels, Patricia would worry aloud about whether I was supervising him properly. March 22nd, I documented. Patricia attended Jake's school play without asking, sat in the front row, and took pictures. When Jake looked for me in the audience, she waved at him and pointed to herself. After the play, she told other parents she was filling in for the missing parent. Jake asked why Grandma Patricia said Mommy should have been there. The most disturbing entries were about Patricia's attempts to insert herself into parenting decisions. She'd call Emma's teacher to discuss classroom concerns without my knowledge. She'd schedule Jake's dental appointment and then inform me after the fact. She'd bought Emma a cell phone for emergencies and then criticized me for not allowing her to keep it. April 3rd, I wrote, Patricia brought groceries without asking what we needed. Threw away the cereal I'd bought because it was too sugary. Told Emma that Daddy doesn't know how to shop for growing children. Emma didn't eat breakfast the next morning because she was confused about which cereal was okay. But the notebook also documented something else: my children's resilience and their clear preference for our family's way of doing things. Emma consistently chose to come to me with problems, even when Patricia was actively trying to position herself as the solution. Jake sought comfort from me during difficult moments, not from his grandmother. April 10th, I noted, Emma fell off her bike and scraped her knee. Patricia immediately started criticizing the bike's safety, my choice of helmet, the location, where we were riding. Emma ignored her and came to me for comfort. When I cleaned the scrape and put on a band-aid, Emma said, Daddy, you're the best at fixing things. Patricia looked genuinely surprised. The documentation process was therapeutic but also heartbreaking. Seeing Patricia's behavior laid out in black and white made me realize how much energy my family had been spending on managing her criticism and control. We'd been walking on eggshells in our own lives, constantly bracing for her next visit, her next judgment, her next attempt to undermine our family dynamic. I started noting the children's responses to Patricia's visits. Emma would become quiet and compliant, losing the natural sparkle that defined her personality. Jake would become clingy and anxious, asking repeatedly if I was happy with him. Both children needed extra reassurance after Patricia's visits, and both would gradually return to their normal selves in the days that followed. April 17th, I wrote, Patricia criticized Emma's choice of clothes for picture day, said the dress was too casual and that other parents would judge our family. Emma changed clothes 3 times and was almost late for school. When pictures came back, Emma looked beautiful and happy. Patricia's first comment was about her posture. The notebook became my anchor, proof that I wasn't imagining the manipulation or overreacting to normal grandparent concerns. Patricia's behavior was systematic, calculated, and designed to undermine my confidence as a parent while positioning herself as the more competent alternative. But as I documented her actions, I also began documenting my own growth. The PTA involvement was giving me confidence and skills. The other parents were treating me as a valued community member. My children were thriving despite Patricia's constant criticism. April 24th, I wrote, Emma told me about her day without prompting. She's excited about the science fair project we're working on together. Jake asked if we could have pancakes for dinner again like last time. Both children seem happy and secure. Patricia's visit yesterday left them temporarily unsettled, but they bounced back quickly. Our family is stronger than her disapproval. The notebook was filling up, but more importantly, it was giving me clarity about what I needed to do next. The coffee shop receipt was crumpled in my pocket for weeks before I finally threw it away, but I'd memorized every detail of that conversation. It was my first real talk with another parent who understood the weight of raising children alone. Marcus Thompson had been coming to PTA meetings for 2 years. Ever since his wife died in a car accident, his daughter Sophia was in Emma's class, and I'd noticed him at school events always present, always engaged, but like me, usually standing slightly apart from the main groups of parents. You want to grab coffee after the meeting? He'd asked, after our discussion about playground safety. I don't know about you, but I could use a debrief. We ended up at Corner Coffee, a small place downtown that stayed open late. Marcus ordered a large black coffee and I got a decaf. Learned that caffeine after 6 meant I'd be awake until midnight, and I needed every hour of sleep I could get. How long have you been doing this alone? Marcus asked once we'd settled into a corner booth. 3 years, I said. You? 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days, he said with a rueful smile. Not that I'm counting. Marcus understood things that other parents didn't. He understood the exhaustion that came from being the only adult responsible for every decision. He understood the guilt that hit when you had to miss a school event because of work. He understood the way other parents sometimes looked at you with pity or suspicion, as if single parenthood were contagious. The hardest part, Marcus told me, is that everyone has an opinion about what you're doing wrong. Sophia's grandmother thinks I'm too strict. My mother thinks I'm too lenient. My sister thinks I should remarry for Sophia's sake. My neighbor thinks I should put her in more activities. Everyone's an expert on how I should be raising my daughter. I thought about Patricia's constant criticism, her systematic campaign to undermine my confidence. Do you ever feel like you're just barely keeping your head above water? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Every single day. But you know what I've learned? The kids are more resilient than we give them credit for. Sophia's grades are good. She has friends. She's polite and kind. Whatever I'm doing wrong, I must be doing something right. That conversation became the foundation of an unlikely support network. Marcus introduced me to Janet Morrison, a divorced mother of 3 who managed the school's volunteer coordinator program. Janet introduced me to Rob Martinez, a widower whose twin boys were in Jake's grade. We started meeting monthly, usually at Corner Coffee, sometimes at each other's houses. We called ourselves the Single Parent Support Group, though we were really just 4 adults who understood each other's challenges. We shared babysitting duties for school events, traded advice about everything from homework strategies to dealing with judgmental relatives, and provided moral support during the rough patches. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, became an unexpected ally as well. She'd been teaching for 15 years and had seen every kind of family structure imaginable. When Patricia started contacting her with concerns about Emma's welfare, Mrs. Rodriguez saw through the manipulation immediately. I've been watching Emma closely since those conversations with her grandmother, Mrs. Rodriguez told me during a parent conference. Emma is one of the most well-adjusted students I've had. She's confident, creative, and kind. Whatever you're doing at home, it's working. Mrs. Rodriguez started documenting Emma's positive behaviors, her helpfulness in the classroom, her empathy toward other students, her academic progress. She kept detailed notes about Emma's emotional state and social interactions, creating a record that directly contradicted Patricia's claims of neglect or instability. Emma talks about you with such pride. Mrs. Rodriguez told me. She mentions the songs you make up for her homework, the way you help her with science projects, the bedtime stories you read together. This is a child who feels loved and secure. Even Jake's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Patterson, became part of my support network. She'd noticed Jake's occasional anxiety after Patricia's visits and had started giving him extra attention on those days. He's such a sweet boy. Mrs. Patterson told me he always asks if I need help cleaning up, and he's very protective of the other children. Those are signs of a child who feels safe and valued at home. The support network wasn't just about validation, it was about practical help. When I had to work late, someone could pick up Emma and Jake. When Patricia showed up uninvited, I had witnesses who could attest to her behavior. When self-doubt crept in, I had people who knew my children and could remind me of the reality of our situation. "You're not perfect," Janet told me one evening as we watched our kids play in her backyard. "None of us are, but you're present, you're committed, and you're learning." That's what good parenting looks like. The receipt from that first coffee with Marcus was small, but it represented something much larger, the beginning of a community that saw my family's worth, not its deficits. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like I was navigating single parenthood alone. The campaign flyer was simple, just my name, a photo of me with Emma and Jake at last year's fall festival, and 3 bullet points about my vision for the PTA. But creating it felt like the most important document I'd ever written. David Miller, for PTA president. It read, "Because parents know what families need." My 3 points were straightforward. Better communication between school and families, more inclusive events for working parents, and practical support for all family structures. Nothing revolutionary, just common sense solutions to problems I'd observed during my year of PTA involvement. The decision to run hadn't been easy. Mrs. Hoffman was stepping down after 2 years, and the usual suspects were positioning themselves for the role. Sandra Walsh had been vice president and assumed she'd inherit the position. Margaret Foster had been treasurer and felt it was her turn. Both women were accomplished, dedicated, and had far more PTA experience than I did, but Marcus had planted the seed during one of our coffee meetings. "You see things differently," he'd said. "You understand what it's like to juggle work and parenting. You ask questions that matter to families like ours." The single parent support group had encouraged me to consider running. Janet Morrison, who'd been involved in PTA politics for years, was brutally honest about my chances. "You're an outsider," she told me. "Some people will see that as a disadvantage, but others are ready for fresh perspective. The key is showing them you understand both the big picture and the details." My campaign was grassroots by necessity. I couldn't afford professional flyers or expensive advertising, so I relied on word of mouth and personal conversations. I attended every school event, volunteered for every committee, and made sure to talk with parents from all backgrounds, not just the traditional PTA crowd. The response surprised me. Working parents appreciated my focus on evening meeting times and childcare during events. Single parents felt seen and heard for the first time. Even traditional families responded to my emphasis on practical solutions over bureaucratic procedures. "Finally, someone who gets it," said Maria Santos, a working mother who'd never attended a PTA meeting because they conflicted with her nursing schedule. "You're talking about real problems, not just fundraising quotas." Patricia's reaction to my campaign was swift and predictable. She started attending school events she'd never shown interest in before, positioning herself as a concerned community member. Her strategy was subtle but effective. She'd express support for my involvement while questioning my qualifications. "It's wonderful that David is so engaged," she'd tell other parents, "though I do worry about him taking on too much when he's already stretched so thin with work and the children." She'd plant seeds of doubt wrapped in apparent concern. Of course, running a PTA requires significant time and organizational skills. "I just hope David realizes what he's getting into." But Patricia underestimated how well I'd integrated into the school community over the past year. Other parents had seen my work on the fall festival, my contributions to the playground safety committee, my willingness to take on tasks like inventory management and volunteer coordination. Mrs. Rodriguez became an unexpected campaign asset. She didn't endorse candidates officially, but she made sure other teachers knew about my involvement in Emma's education and my support for classroom initiatives. "Mr. Miller is one of the most engaged parents I've worked with," she told Mrs. Patterson during a conversation I accidentally overheard. "He understands that supporting children means supporting their entire educational environment." My campaign speech was scheduled for the week before the election. I'd practiced it dozens of times, but standing at the podium in the school cafeteria, looking out at 43 parents who would decide my fate, my hands were shaking. 2 years ago, I was overwhelmed, exhausted, and convinced I was failing my children. I thought good parenting meant doing everything perfectly. I thought asking for help was admitting defeat. I talked about joining the PTA as a scared single father who felt out of place. I talked about learning that community involvement wasn't about proving your worth, it was about contributing your unique perspective. I talked about my vision for a PTA that supported all families, not just those who fit traditional models. "I'm not running because I have all the answers," I concluded. I'm running because I've learned the right questions to ask. Questions like, how can we make school events accessible to working parents? How can we support families during crisis? How can we build a community where every child feels valued and every parent feels heard? The applause was warm, but not overwhelming. Sandra Walsh's speech was polished and experienced. Margaret Foster's presentation was detailed and comprehensive. I left the meeting genuinely unsure about the outcome. Patricia cornered me in the parking lot. That was a lovely speech, David, she said, her smile sharp, though I couldn't help but notice you didn't mention your lack of administrative experience. Running a PTA isn't the same as working retail, you know? I looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. You're right, Patricia. It's much more important. Election day was the following Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, I'd won by the largest margin in Roosevelt Elementary's history. The election results certificate was printed on official school letterhead. David Miller, minus 31 votes. Sandra Walsh, 28 votes. Margaret Foster, 4 votes. 43 parents had participated in the election, and I'd won with 72% of the vote. Mrs. Rodriguez handed me the certificate after school on Wednesday, her smile genuine and proud. The parents spoke pretty clearly. She said, "Congratulations, Mr. President." Emma was with me when I received the news, and her excitement was infectious. "Daddy, you won. You're the president." She hugged my legs so tightly I almost lost my balance. "What does that mean?" Jake asked when I told him at dinner. "It means Daddy gets to help make the school an even better place for you and Emma," I explained. "And for all the other kids too." The congratulations came throughout the week. Parents approached me at pickup with genuine enthusiasm. Marcus clapped me on the back at our next coffee meeting. "You did it, man. Now the real work begins." But Patricia's reaction was volcanic. She called that evening, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she said without preamble, "taking on responsibilities you can't possibly handle while those children need your attention." "The children are proud of me, Patricia," I replied calmly, "just like I'm proud of them." "This is exactly the kind of overcommitment that led to Jessica leaving," she snapped. "You never know when to focus on what actually matters." The accusation stung because it was designed to. Patricia had perfected the art of weaponizing my insecurities, but this time I was ready for it. "Jessica left because she wanted a different life," I said. "That has nothing to do with my involvement in our children's education. We'll see how long this lasts," Patricia said before hanging up. "Leadership requires more than good intentions." Her prediction felt ominous, but I didn't have to wait long to understand what she meant. The next week, Patricia launched what could only be described as a shadow campaign against my presidency. She started attending every PTA meeting, something she'd never done before. She'd arrive early, position herself prominently, and make sure everyone knew she was Emma and Jake's grandmother. Her strategy was sophisticated. She didn't directly criticize me, but she questioned every decision and suggested alternatives that highlighted my inexperience. "I'm sure David has considered the liability implications of the new playground equipment," she'd say during meetings, her tone suggesting I obviously hadn't. "Perhaps we should consult with someone who has experience in risk management." She volunteered for committees she'd never shown interest in, then used those positions to second-guess my initiatives. When I proposed moving meeting times to accommodate working parents, Patricia worried aloud about rushing important decisions to accommodate busy schedules. Her most effective tactic was positioning herself as the voice of experience and tradition. "Of course, we've always done fundraising this way," she'd say when I suggested new approaches. "Change for the sake of change isn't always improvement." The worst part was watching how her behavior affected Emma and Jake. They could sense the tension but couldn't understand it. Emma started asking why Grandma Patricia came to so many school events now. "Is Daddy in trouble?" Jake asked one evening, after Patricia had attended his class reading program. "No, sweetheart," I assured him. "Grandma Patricia is just interested in your school." But privately, I was struggling. Patricia's constant presence and subtle undermining were taking a toll. I found myself second-guessing decisions I felt confident about, over-preparing for meetings to avoid her criticism, and losing sleep worrying about her next move. The breakthrough came during my third week as president. I was presenting the budget proposal when Patricia interrupted with a question about expense categories. "I'm concerned about the line item for family support services," she said. "What exactly does that entail?" The line item was for emergency assistance, helping families who couldn't afford field trip fees, providing school supplies for children in need, creating a small fund for families experiencing temporary hardship. It was one of my key initiatives, born from my own struggles. As a working single parent, it's a support fund for families facing temporary challenges, I explained. Sometimes parents need help with school expenses, and we want to make sure every child can participate in school activities. Patricia's expression sharpened. "And who would determine which families qualify for this assistance? What criteria would prevent abuse of such a system?" The room grew uncomfortable. Other parents shifted in their seats, sensing the undercurrent of conflict. But then Sarah Chen, the mother who'd welcomed me at my first meeting, spoke up. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said firmly. Last year, 3 families left the school because they couldn't afford the additional fees. If we can help even one family stay in our community, the program is worthwhile. Other parents began voicing support. Marcus talked about the isolation that financial stress creates. Janet Morrison mentioned families she knew who struggled silently rather than ask for help. Margaret Foster, my former opponent, said she wished she'd thought of the initiative herself. Patricia found herself outnumbered and outmaneuvered. For the first time since the election, her criticism had backfired. The room full of parents wasn't seeing an inexperienced president making questionable decisions. They were seeing a grandmother trying to undermine a program designed to help struggling families. After the meeting, several parents approached me with additional support. "Don't let her get to you," whispered Maria Santos. "She's not fooling anyone." That night, I updated my documentation notebook with a new realization. Patricia's attacks were making me stronger, more focused, and more determined to succeed. Her attempts to undermine my presidency were actually helping me build broader community support. But I also realized that her escalation meant she wasn't going to stop. If anything, my success was making her more desperate, more determined to prove I was unfit to lead or to parent. The PTA President Handbook was a thin binder that outlined my official responsibilities, but it represented something much more significant: legitimate authority within my children's school community. For the first time in 3 years, I had a platform that Patricia couldn't undermine or dismiss. My first initiative was implementing the Family Support Fund that had sparked Patricia's opposition. Within 2 weeks, we'd raised $800 through small donations from parents who understood financial stress. The first family we helped was the Johnsons, whose father had been laid off right before the spring field trip deadlines. "You have no idea what this means," Mrs. Johnson told me when I discreetly handed her the envelope with field trip money for both her children. Kayla was so worried she wouldn't be able to go with her class. Word spread quickly about the fund, but also about the way it was administered with dignity, privacy, and genuine care for families in need. Parents began approaching me with both donations and stories of their own struggles. I realized how many families had been silently dealing with financial pressures while trying to maintain appearances. Patricia's attempts to question the fund's management became increasingly transparent. She demanded detailed accounting records, suggested we needed oversight committees, and implied that some families might be taking advantage of the program. Her concerns rang hollow when the entire parent community could see the positive impact. My second major initiative addressed the scheduling issues that had prevented working parents from participating in school activities. We moved PTA meetings to 6:30 p.m. and provided childcare. We scheduled parent conferences in early morning and evening slots. We created weekend volunteer opportunities for parents who couldn't help during school hours. The response was immediate. Parents who'd never been able to attend PTA meetings started showing up. Working mothers joined committees. Single parents found ways to contribute that worked with their schedules. Our volunteer base doubled within a month. Patricia tried to frame these changes as unnecessary complications. "We've always held meetings at 2 p.m., she'd say. "Parents who care about their children's education find a way to attend." But her criticism fell flat when the room was full of engaged parents who'd never been able to participate before. Maria Santos, the nurse who worked swing shifts, became our most active volunteer coordinator. Rob Martinez started a weekend maintenance crew that accomplished more in 2 Saturdays than we'd managed in months of after-school work sessions. The power shift was subtle but unmistakable. Where Patricia had once been able to position herself as the voice of authority and experience, she was now increasingly isolated. Her constant criticism of my initiatives was making her seem obstructionist rather than helpful. The breaking point came during our discussion of the fall festival. I proposed expanding the event to include more diverse food options and cultural activities, reflecting the school's increasingly diverse student body. It was a logical evolution that several parents had suggested. Patricia immediately objected. "The fall festival has always been focused on traditional autumn activities," she said. "We shouldn't change things just to be politically correct." The comment landed badly. Several parents exchanged glances. Sarah Chen, whose family had emigrated from Taiwan, looked genuinely hurt. The Martinez family, who'd volunteered to coordinate a Hispanic heritage booth, appeared taken aback. "I think celebrating our community's diversity strengthens our school," I said carefully. "The children learn from each other's traditions and experiences. Some traditions are worth preserving," Patricia insisted. "Not everything needs to be transformed to accommodate every perspective." Marcus Thompson, usually quiet during meetings, spoke up. "Mrs. Patricia, with respect, my daughter Sophia is excited to share her family's Jamaican traditions with her classmates. She doesn't see it as accommodation, she sees it as belonging." The room was silent for a moment. Then Janet Morrison began talking about her family's Irish heritage and how much her children enjoyed learning about their classmates' backgrounds. Other parents joined in, sharing stories about cultural exchanges and the richness that diversity brought to their children's education. Patricia found herself defending an increasingly unpopular position. Her insistence on traditional approaches began to sound exclusionary rather than principled. Parents who'd previously been neutral in our dynamic started to see her opposition as something more problematic than simple criticism. After the meeting, I received multiple emails and texts from parents expressing support for the expanded festival and concern about Patricia's comments. That was uncomfortable, wrote one parent. I felt like she was dismissing my family's contributions. The handbooks section on building community consensus became my guide for navigating these situations. I learned to let Patricia's words speak for themselves rather than responding defensively. I focused on articulating positive visions rather than arguing against her criticisms, but Patricia's escalation meant she was becoming more desperate. Her subtle undermining was being replaced by more direct confrontation. Her criticism was becoming personal rather than policy-focused. Her behavior was starting to affect the children directly. Emma came home from school, upset because Patricia had attended her class presentation and corrected her pronunciation in front of her classmates. Jake asked why Grandma Patricia looked angry when she saw him playing with his friend Carlos. The power shift was working in my favor professionally, but Patricia's increasing desperation was making our family situation more volatile. My success as PTA president was proving I could lead and organize effectively, but it was also making Patricia more determined to find other ways to undermine my role as a father. The handbook couldn't prepare me for what was coming next. The family photos were scattered across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I'd never wanted to solve. I'd found them while cleaning out a box of Jessica's belongings that had been sitting in my closet for 3 years. Photos from birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings that told a story I was only now beginning to understand. In picture after picture, the pattern was unmistakable. Patricia wasn't just present at family events, she was orchestrating them. In our wedding photos, she was positioned between Jessica and me in nearly every group shot. At Emma's first birthday party, Patricia was holding Emma while Jessica and I stood awkwardly to the side. During Christmas mornings, Patricia was the one distributing gifts while the rest of us waited for her direction, but it was the subtle details that revealed the depth of her control. Jessica's body language in later photos showed increasing tension and uncertainty. Her smiles became forced. Her posture grew defensive. In pictures from our last Christmas together, Jessica looked like a guest in her own family. I found a photo from Emma's 4th birthday that stopped me cold. Patricia was cutting the cake while Jessica stood behind her, hands clasped, looking lost. Emma was reaching toward me, but Patricia had positioned herself between us. Jake was crying in the background, and no one was comforting him. That's when I remembered the conversation that followed that party. Jessica had tried to cut the cake herself, but Patricia had gently taken the knife from her hands. "Let me handle this, dear," she'd said. "You know how important it is to cut evenly." The incident seemed minor at the time, but looking at the photo now, I could see Jessica's humiliation. Her own mother had publicly declared her incompetent to cut her daughter's birthday cake. In front of our friends, our neighbors, our children, I pulled out my phone and called Lisa, Jessica's sister. We'd maintained a relationship because she was Emma and Jake's aunt, but we rarely talked about the deeper family dynamics. "Lisa, can I ask you something about Patricia and Jessica?" There was a long pause. "What do you want to know?" Was Patricia always so controlling? Another pause. Longer this time. "David, I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question." Lisa came over that evening after Emma and Jake were in bed. She brought her own box of photos and a bottle of wine. What she told me explained everything. "Patricia started grooming Jessica for dependency when she was young," Lisa said, laying out photos from Jessica's childhood. "She made all of Jessica's decisions: what clothes to wear, which friends to have, what activities to join. Jessica never learned to trust her own judgment." The childhood photos showed Jessica always looking to Patricia for approval, even in casual moments. Birthday wishes, school presentations, family vacations, every picture. Jessica's eyes were on her mother, seeking validation or permission. "When Jessica met you, Patricia saw it as a threat," Lisa continued. "You were encouraging Jessica to make independent decisions. You supported her career goals. You made her laugh without asking permission first." I remembered those early days of our relationship. Jessica had been confident and spontaneous, full of ideas and dreams. But gradually, after we got engaged and Patricia became more involved in our lives, Jessica had become more hesitant, more dependent on others' opinions. Patricia started undermining Jessica's confidence systematically, Lisa explained. She'd suggest that Jessica's career goals were unrealistic. She'd point out every mistake Jessica made. She'd offer to help with decisions and then gradually take over the decision-making process. The wedding planning had been the first major battleground. Patricia had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the guest list, the menu. Jessica had deferred to her on most decisions, saying she wanted to avoid conflict. By our wedding day, Jessica felt like a spectator at her own celebration. The pregnancy was when Patricia really ramped up the control, Lisa said. She convinced Jessica that she was too young and inexperienced to make parenting decisions alone. She bought all the baby furniture without consulting you. She scheduled Jessica's doctor appointments. She even tried to be in the delivery room. I remembered the fights about Patricia's involvement during Emma's birth. I'd thought I was being territorial, but now I realized I was fighting for my role as a parent and partner. After Emma was born, Patricia was at your house every day, Lisa continued. She criticized everything Jessica did, how she fed Emma, how she dressed her, how she scheduled naps. Jessica became convinced she was a terrible mother. The photos from Emma's first year showed this dynamic clearly. In early pictures, Jessica looked confident holding her baby, but as the months progressed, Jessica appeared increasingly anxious. In later photos, Patricia was always the one holding Emma, while Jessica stood nearby looking uncertain. Patricia did the same thing when Jake was born, Lisa said. By then, Jessica was completely dependent on her mother's approval for every parenting decision. Jessica couldn't trust herself to choose Jake's clothes without Patricia's input. Thought about Jessica's increasing unhappiness in our final year of marriage. She'd seemed restless and frustrated, but I'd attributed it to the stress of having 2 young children. Now I understood that she'd been suffocating under Patricia's control, but she'd blamed our marriage instead of her mother's manipulation. When Jessica met Richard online, Patricia actually encouraged the relationship, Lisa revealed. She saw it as an opportunity to get Jessica away from Youth, the one person who might help Jessica recognize the manipulation. The final photo Lisa showed me was from Jessica's goodbye party, thrown by Patricia 2 weeks before Jessica moved to California. Jessica looked terrified, not excited. She was clinging to Emma and Jake like she was drowning. Jessica called me from California after a month, Lisa said quietly. She was miserable and wanted to come home. But Patricia convinced her that returning would prove she was a failure, that you and the children were better off without her. Looking at the scattered photos, I finally understood the full scope of Patricia's manipulation. She hadn't just undermined my marriage, she'd systematically destroyed her own daughter's confidence and independence. Jessica's abandonment of Emma and Jake wasn't just about wanting a fresh start. It was about a woman so broken by years of manipulation that she couldn't trust herself to be a mother. And now, Patricia was trying to do the same thing to me, potentially to my children. The photos went back into their boxes, but the clarity remained. Patricia's criticism of my parenting wasn't about concern for Emma and Jake. It was about maintaining control, the same control she'd wielded over Jessica, until Jessica finally escaped the only way she knew how. But unlike Jessica, I wasn't going to run. I was going to fight. The school counselor's notes were written in careful professional language, but they told a story that made my hands shake as I read them. Mrs. Washington had requested a meeting after observing changes in Emma's and Jake's behavior following Patricia's increased presence at school. Both children show signs of stress when their grandmother visits. The notes read, Emma becomes withdrawn and self-conscious. Jake displays increased anxiety and seeks adult reassurance. Both children express confusion about their father's competency, suggesting they're receiving conflicting messages about his parenting. Mrs. Washington had been the school counselor for 12 years. She'd seen every kind of family dynamic, every form of childhood stress. When she called to request a meeting, I knew something serious was happening. Mr. Miller, she said as we sat in her small office decorated with children's artwork, I want to talk with you about some things the children have shared with me. Emma had been visiting the counselor's office during lunch periods, initially claiming she wanted to help organize supplies. But gradually, she'd begun talking about her confusion regarding different adults' expectations. Emma mentioned that, you help her with homework every night, Mrs. Washington said, reading from her notes. She says you're patient and make learning fun. But she also mentioned that her grandmother tells her the homework isn't done correctly and needs to be redone. I thought about the math worksheets Patricia had criticized, the science project she'd insisted we restart, the book reports she'd declared sloppy despite Emma's pride in her work. Emma is a confident, capable student, Mrs. Washington continued, but lately, she's been second-guessing herself. She asked me yesterday if her handwriting was good enough, and whether her project about butterflies was too babyish. The counselor's notes documented specific incidents that revealed Patricia's impact on Emma's self-esteem. Emma had stopped raising her hand in class because she was afraid her answers might be wrong. She'd asked Mrs. Rodriguez if she could redo an assignment that had already earned an A. She'd cried during art class because she was worried her painting wasn't neat enough. Jake's behaviors were different but equally concerning. He'd started asking his kindergarten teacher for constant reassurance about following rules. He'd become clingy during drop-off times. He'd asked Mrs. Patterson if his daddy was doing okay, and whether she thought he was taking good care of me and Emma. 6-year-olds shouldn't be worried about their parents' competency, Mrs. Washington said gently. Jake loves you deeply, but someone is planting seeds of doubt about your ability to care for him. The most heartbreaking note described a conversation Jake had with the counselor about family roles. When asked to draw his family, Jake had drawn himself, Emma, and me standing together. But he'd drawn Patricia as a much larger figure, standing apart from us with the word boss above her head. When I asked Jake about the drawing, he said, Grandma, Patricia makes the rules for his family, Mrs. Washington explained. He said she decides what's right and wrong, and that sometimes Daddy doesn't know the rules. Mrs. Washington had also documented the positive changes in both children when Patricia wasn't around. Emma's confidence returned during school hours. Jake played freely with other children and engaged enthusiastically in classroom activities. Both children talked about home with warmth and affection, describing our bedtime routines, weekend activities, and family traditions with obvious joy. Your children clearly feel loved and secure with you, Mrs. Washington said, but they're receiving conflicting messages that are creating internal stress. They're trying to reconcile their positive experience of family life with criticism that suggests their father isn't competent. She showed me drawings both children had made during different counseling sessions. When asked to draw a happy family, Emma drew the three of us reading together on the couch. When asked to draw a worried family, she drew Patricia pointing at me, while Emma and Jake stood between us, looking confused. Jake's drawings were even more revealing. His happy family pictures showed us playing in the yard, cooking together, and hugging. His worried family pictures showed Patricia holding him and Emma, while I stood far away looking sad. The children are being forced to choose between loyalty to you and obedience to their grandmother, Mrs. Washington explained. That's an impossible position for children their age, but the counselor's notes also documented the children's resilience and their clear preference for our family's way of functioning. Emma had told Mrs. Washington that she felt safe and happy at home with me. Jake had described our morning routines as the best part of the day. Emma told me something interesting last week, Mrs. Washington said. She said that when it's just the three of you, she feels like she can be herself. But when her grandmother visits, she feels like she has to be perfect all the time. The notes included direct quotes from both children that broke my heart and filled me with pride simultaneously. Emma had said, "Daddy makes mistakes sometimes, but he always fixes them and says he's sorry." Jake had told the counselor, "Daddy hugs me when I'm sad, even if I did something wrong." But they'd also quoted Emma saying, "I don't understand why Grandma Patricia thinks Daddy doesn't know how to take care of us. He takes really good care of us." And Jake asking, "Why does Grandma Patricia look sad when Daddy and I are playing?" Mrs. Washington's professional assessment was clear. The children were experiencing stress from conflicting adult authority figures, but their primary attachment and trust was clearly with me. Patricia's criticism wasn't protecting them, it was confusing and hurting them. "I'm recommending that we limit disruptions to the children's sense of security," Mrs. Washington said carefully. "They need consistency and clarity about who makes decisions in their family." As I left the meeting, I realized that Patricia's campaign against my parenting wasn't just undermining MIT, was actively harming Emma and Jake. Her attempts to position herself as the better caregiver were teaching my children to doubt the very parent who provided their daily love, support, and security. The counselor's notes would become crucial documentation. But more importantly, they gave me the clarity I needed. This wasn't about Patricia's concern for the children's welfare. This was about her need for control, even at the expense of their emotional well-being. It was time to take action. The custody agreement was a simple document, 2 pages, that gave me full legal and physical custody of Emma and Jake, with Jessica's rights terminated voluntarily when she moved to California. But sitting in attorney Sarah Mitchell's office, I learned that Patricia's behavior had legal implications I'd never considered. Sarah Mitchell, no relation, despite sharing my last name, specialized in family law, and had been recommended by Janet Morrison, who'd used her services during her own divorce. Sarah was direct, practical, and had seen enough family manipulation to recognize the patterns immediately. "Let me understand the situation," Sarah said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "Your former mother-in-law has been conducting a systematic campaign to undermine your parenting, interfering with your children's education, and making threats about custody modification, and she's doing this despite having no legal standing whatsoever." When she put it that way, Patricia's behavior sounded even more outrageous. I'd been so focused on defending myself against her criticism that I hadn't fully grasped how legally inappropriate her actions were. "Patricia has no custody rights," Sarah explained. "She has no legal authority to make decisions about Emma and Jake's care, education, or welfare. Her interference in school matters, her attempts to override your parenting decisions, and her threats about custody modification constitute harassment." Sarah pulled out a legal pad and started making notes as I described Patricia's escalating behavior, the uninvited visits, the criticism in front of the children, the text messages to family members, the attempts to influence school staff. Each incident had legal significance. "Grandparents do have visitation rights in some circumstances," Sarah explained, "but only when it's in the children's best interest and doesn't interfere with the custodial parent's authority. What you're describing goes far beyond grandparent visitation. This is an attempt to undermine your parental authority." The most serious concern was Patricia's documented threats about seeking custody modification. Sarah pulled out copies of the text messages Lisa had forwarded, reading them with a lawyer's eye for legal implications. "These messages suggest she's been planning some kind of legal action against you," Sarah said. "The references to best interests of the children and court prioritizing capable caregivers indicate she's been consulting with someone about custody laws." Sarah explained that grandparents could petition for custody in extreme circumstances if the custodial parent was found unfit, if there was evidence of abuse or neglect, or if the parent voluntarily relinquished custody, but they'd need substantial evidence of parental unfitness, not just disapproval of parenting styles. Has she ever witnessed or documented any actual negligence? Sarah asked. Missed meals? Unsafe conditions? Educational neglect? Medical neglect? I thought through 3 years of Patricia's criticism. She's complained about everything: my children's clothes, their hairstyles, their bedtime routines, their screen time, but she's never witnessed actual neglect because there hasn't been any. That's what I thought, Sarah said. This isn't about child welfare, this is about control. And control isn't a legal basis for custody modification. Sarah reviewed the school counselor's notes with particular interest. Mrs. Washington's professional documentation of the children's stress and confusion carried significant legal weight. The notes established that Patricia's interference was harming the children, not helping them. Professional documentation from school personnel is incredibly valuable, Sarah explained. It shows that your children are thriving under your care, but experiencing stress from your former mother-in-law's interference. She also reviewed the PTA election results and my documented community involvement. Your engagement in the children's education and your leadership role in the school community demonstrate active, involved, parenting. This contradicts any claims of neglect or disengagement. But Sarah's most important advice concerned documentation and boundaries. You need to establish clear legal boundaries immediately, she said. Patricia's behavior is escalating, and escalation often leads to more desperate actions. She recommended several immediate steps: sending Patricia a formal cease and desist letter, documenting all future interactions, establishing clear visitation boundaries, and preparing for the possibility that Patricia might attempt legal action despite her weak position. People who've lost control sometimes make irrational, legal decisions, Sarah warned. She might file frivolous motions or make false allegations. We need to be prepared. The cease and desist letter would be the first formal step. Sarah would draft a document clearly stating that Patricia's interference with my parental authority needed to stop immediately. The letter would outline specific behaviors that were unacceptable: uninvited visits, criticism of parenting decisions in front of the children, contact with school personnel without my permission, and any attempts to undermine my authority as the custodial parent. The letter serves two purposes, Sarah explained. It establishes clear boundaries and creates a legal record if we need to pursue restraining orders later. She also recommended that I request supervised visitation only. Given the documented emotional harm to the children, you have grounds to require that all contact between Patricia and the children occur in your presence or with your explicit permission. The financial implications were concerning. Legal fees for family law cases could escalate quickly, especially if Patricia decided to fight the boundaries we were establishing. Sarah was honest about the cost. A simple cease and desist letter would cost $500. But if Patricia responded with legal action, we could be looking at thousands of dollars in defense costs. However, Sarah added, Patricia's financial situation might work in your favor. From what you've described, she's been financially dependent on others. Legal action is expensive, and frivolous suits can result in sanctions and fee awards to the defending party. Sarah also explained the concept of parental alienation, attempts by third parties to undermine the relationship between children and their custodial parent. Patricia's systematic criticism of my parenting in front of Emma and Jake, her attempts to position herself as a superior caregiver, and her efforts to make the children doubt my competence all fit the legal definition of alienation attempts. Courts take parental alienation seriously, Sarah said. The children's counselor notes document the emotional harm these behaviors are causing. That gives us strong grounds for protective orders if necessary. The meeting ended with a clear action plan. Sarah would draft the cease and desist letter immediately. I would continue documenting all interactions with Patricia, save all text messages and emails, and maintain detailed records of the children's emotional responses to her visits. Most importantly, Sarah said, don't engage with her provocations. Let the legal system handle this. Your job is to continue being the excellent father you clearly are, while protecting your children from ongoing manipulation. As I left Sarah's office, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that Patricia's behavior had clear legal remedies, but apprehension about the conflict that was clearly escalating. I'd spent 3 years trying to manage Patricia's criticism and control through patience and accommodation. Now I understood that legal boundaries weren't just appropriate. They were necessary to protect my children's well-being. The custody agreement that had seemed like a simple formality 3 years ago had become my shield. Jessica's voluntary termination of her parental rights meant that Patricia had no legal standing to challenge my decisions or interfere with my family. She'd been operating on assumed authority that had never actually existed. Walking to my car, I realized that this legal consultation had given me something I'd been missing: the confidence that comes from knowing your rights and having professional support. Patricia's threats and manipulation tactics were about to encounter something she hadn't expected: actual legal consequences for her behavior. The cease and desist letter would arrive at Patricia's house within 48 hours. Her reaction would tell me everything I needed to know about what came next. The security camera footage was grainy, but clear enough to document what I'd suspected for months. Patricia was monitoring our family far more closely than I'd realized. The cameras, installed after my locksmith changed our locks, captured her driving by our house multiple times per week, sometimes parking across the street for extended periods. I'd installed the simple security system on Marcus's recommendation after Patricia's reaction to the cease and desist letter. She'd called within an hour of receiving it, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you threaten me with legal action?" she'd said. "I'm those children's grandmother. I have rights." "You have the right to visit with Emma and Jake," I'd replied calmly. "But those visits need to respect my role as their parent." "Your role?" She'd laughed bitterly. "You mean your failure? Those children need proper guidance, not some retail worker playing house." The personal attack was nothing new, but the venom in her voice had been startling. When she'd hung up on me, I'd known the conflict was about to escalate significantly. The camera footage proved I was right. In the week following the cease and desist letter, Patricia had driven by our house 17 times. She'd parked across the street during Emma's playdates, documenting who came and went. She'd followed my car to the grocery store twice, observing what I bought and how I interacted with the children in public. But the footage also captured more disturbing behavior. On Tuesday evening, while I was at a PTA meeting, and the children were with Mrs. Kim, Patricia had approached our babysitter at the park. The camera couldn't capture audio, but I could see Patricia talking intently while Mrs. Kim looked increasingly uncomfortable. When I asked Mrs. Kim about the conversation, her distress was obvious. "She asked many questions about your parenting," Mrs. Kim said in her careful English. "She wanted to know about bedtimes, about meals, about discipline. She said she was concerned about the children's welfare." Patricia had also questioned Mrs. Kim about my work schedule, my social life, and whether I ever seemed overwhelmed or stressed. She'd offered to help with childcare and suggested that Mrs. Kim should report any concerns about my parenting to her directly. "I told her the children are happy and well cared for," Mrs. Kim said, but she seemed disappointed by this answer. The security cameras also revealed that Patricia had been documenting our daily routines. She knew when we left for school, when we returned home, when we went grocery shopping, and when we had visitors. She'd taken photos of my car in the driveway, captured images of the children playing in our backyard, and recorded video of our weekend activities. This level of surveillance went far beyond grandparent concern. It was harassment with the clear intent of gathering evidence for some kind of legal action. Patricia was building a case against my parenting, documenting every moment she could interpret as inadequate care. The breaking point came during Emma's soccer game on Saturday. Patricia arrived uninvited, positioned herself prominently in the stands, and began what could only be described as a performance of concerned grandparent behavior. She cheered loudly for Emma, took dozens of photos, and made sure other parents noticed her presence. But her real purpose became clear during halftime. She approached other parents, introducing herself as Emma's grandmother and expressing concern about my overwhelming responsibilities. She suggested that Emma seemed tired lately, that she was worried about my ability to balance work and parenting, and that she was considering stepping in to help more. Sarah Chen later told me about the conversation. "She made it sound like you were struggling and she was the solution," Sarah said. "But Emma looks happy and healthy to me. She's one of the most energetic kids on the team." Patricia's performance was carefully calculated. She positioned herself as the devoted grandmother, stepping up to help an overwhelmed single father. To casual observers, her behavior might have seemed admirable, but I could see the manipulation. She was creating a public narrative that supported her claims about my inadequacy as a parent. The soccer game incident was captured on my phone's camera when Patricia confronted me directly after the game. Emma was gathering her equipment when Patricia approached, her voice loud enough for other parents to hear. "David, we need to talk about Emma's schedule," she said. "This is too much activity for a child who's already dealing with family instability." Emma looked confused. She loved soccer and had been excited about the game all week. She looked between Patricia and me, clearly upset by the suggestion that her activities were problematic. "Emma's schedule is fine," I said quietly. "She enjoys soccer, and she's doing well in school." "You're not seeing the signs," Patricia insisted. "She's exhausted. She needs stability, not constant activity to distract from the real issues." The accusation was loud enough that several other parents turned to listen. Patricia was creating a public scene designed to make me look defensive and unreasonable. But this time, her tactics backfired. Marcus Thompson, who'd been watching from nearby, stepped forward. "Emma seems like one of the happiest kids here," he said to Patricia. "She's always smiling and encouraging her teammates." Other parents began nodding in agreement. Sarah Chen mentioned Emma's enthusiasm during practice. Coach Rodriguez commented on Emma's positive attitude and consistent attendance. Patricia found herself contradicted by multiple witnesses who'd observed Emma's actual behavior rather than Patricia's interpretation of it. The public nature of Patricia's criticism had finally worked against her. Instead of creating doubt about my parenting, she'd revealed her own bias and manipulation to the community that knew Emma best. That evening, I received 3 text messages from other soccer parents expressing support and concern about Patricia's behavior. That was uncomfortable to watch, one parent wrote. Emma clearly adores you and seems very well-adjusted, but I also knew that Patricia's public confrontation meant she was no longer trying to work within normal family boundaries. She was escalating to community involvement, trying to build public support for her position that I was an inadequate parent. The security footage, the babysitter interrogation, the soccer game confrontation, all of it pointed to Patricia preparing for some kind of formal action. She wasn't just criticizing my parenting anymore. She was building a case, documenting evidence, and creating public narratives to support a legal challenge to my custody. The question wasn't whether Patricia would escalate further. The question was how far she was willing to go to maintain control over Emma and Jake's lives. The email chain was forwarded to me by Jessica herself, arriving in my inbox at 2:30 a.m. with the subject line, "You need to see this." For 3 years, I'd wondered about Jessica's sudden departure and her complete abandonment of Emma and Jake. The emails revealed a conspiracy that was far more calculated than I'd ever imagined. The thread started 6 months before Jessica left, with Patricia writing to her daughter about David's concerning behavior and the children's declining welfare. But these weren't casual expressions of concern. They were systematic attempts to convince Jessica that I was an unfit parent and that drastic action was necessary. "I've been watching carefully," Patricia had written in the earliest email. "David, it is overwhelmed and making poor decisions. Emma's behavior is becoming more defiant, and Jake seems anxious. I think we need to consider more significant intervention." The emails revealed that Patricia had been documenting my parenting for months. Before Jessica left, creating a false narrative of family dysfunction, she'd twisted normal childhood behaviors into evidence of my inadequacy. Emma's age-appropriate independence became defiance. Jake's occasional clinginess became anxiety, and my work schedule became neglect. But the most shocking revelation was Patricia's long-term plan. She hadn't just encouraged Jessica to leave, she'd orchestrated the entire scenario to position herself as the children's primary caregiver. "Once you're established in California," Patricia had written, "we can revisit custody arrangements. David won't be able to manage on his own, and the children will need stability. I'm prepared to step in as their guardian until you're ready to have them join you." The emails showed that Patricia had never intended for Jessica to take Emma and Jake to California. Instead, she'd planned for Jessica to abandon the children so that Patricia could petition for custody based on my supposed inability to care for them alone. "You deserve your fresh start," Patricia had written, "but the children deserve proper care. David's retail job can't support a family, and he has no experience managing a household. Within 6 months, he'll be overwhelmed and the children will suffer. That's when we act." Jessica's responses revealed her own manipulation and weakness. She'd expressed guilt about leaving the children, but Patricia had systematically undermined those maternal instincts. "The children will be better off with consistent care," Patricia had assured her. "Your leaving will prove David can't handle responsibility. I'll document everything: school events, inadequate meals, behavioral problems. When we petition for custody, we'll have evidence that the children need proper supervision." The emails documented Patricia's step-by-step plan to sabotage my single parenting. She'd intended to create crises that would demonstrate my incompetence, document every struggle as evidence of unfitness, and position herself as the obvious solution to the children's welfare. "I'll be checking on them daily," Patricia had written. "Every missed homework assignment, every fast food dinner, every time David looks overwhelmed in public, I'll document it all. Family court prioritizes the children's best interests, and I can provide stability that David simply can't." But the plan had a fatal flaw. I hadn't failed as a single parent. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, I'd grown stronger, more engaged, and more competent. The evidence Patricia had planned to collect of my inadequacy simply didn't exist. The email chain also revealed why Patricia's criticism had become more desperate and public over the past year. Her original timeline had assumed I'd be overwhelmed and struggling by now. Instead, I'd become PTA president, built a support network, and created a stable, loving home for Emma and Jake. "David is not failing like we expected," Patricia had written in a more recent email. "He's somehow managing better than anticipated. We may need to be more active in creating situations that demonstrate his inadequacy." The phrase "creating situations" sent chills through me. Patricia wasn't just documenting problems, she was actively trying to create them. Jessica's final email in the chain explained why she'd forwarded everything to me. She'd been in therapy in California, working through her relationship with her mother and her abandonment of her children. Her therapist had helped her recognize the manipulation and control that had shaped her decisions. "David," Jessica had written in her cover email, I know I can never undo the damage I've done to you and the children, but you need to know that leaving wasn't really my idea. It was Mom's plan from the beginning. She convinced me that I was doing what was best for everyone, but I see now that I was just her tool for maintaining control. I'm sharing these emails because you have the right to protect Emma and Jake from what she's planning. The emails included Patricia's recent communications, showing her escalating desperation as her original plan failed. She'd begun researching legal options for grandparent custody, consulting with attorneys about emergency intervention for children at risk, and developing new strategies for documenting my supposed inadequacy. If David won't fail naturally, we need to be more strategic, Patricia had written just 2 weeks ago. I'm documenting everything now: his work schedule, the children's activities, his social connections. There has to be something we can use to demonstrate that the children need better care. The most disturbing email was Patricia's recent message about escalating interventions. She'd written about reporting me to Child Protective Services, claiming that children were being neglected or emotionally abused. She'd researched the process for emergency custody removal and had prepared detailed allegations about my fitness. As a parent, reading through the complete email chain, I realized that every criticism, every unexpected visit, every attempt to undermine my parenting had been part of a calculated campaign to take my children away from me. Patricia hadn't been acting out of concern for Emma and Jake. She'd been executing a 3-year plan to gain legal custody. But the emails also provided me with something invaluable: documented proof of Patricia's manipulation, her false allegations, and her deliberate attempts to sabotage my family. Jessica's decision to share this evidence had given me the documentation I needed to protect Emma and Jake from their grandmother's escalating desperation. I forwarded the entire email chain to attorney Sarah Mitchell with a message: emergency consultation needed. Patricia's behavior is part of a documented plan to take my children. The truth was finally revealed, but the real confrontation was just beginning. The restraining order was filed on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, Patricia was served with papers that legally prohibited her from contacting me, approaching our home, or interfering with Emma and Jake's education. But I knew the legal document was just the beginning of a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. Sarah Mitchell had acted swiftly after reviewing Jessica's email evidence. This is one of the clearest cases of attempted parental alienation and custodial interference I've ever seen, she'd told me during our emergency consultation. The emails document a deliberate conspiracy to remove your children from your care based on fabricated evidence. The restraining order was comprehensive. Patricia was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of our home, contacting school personnel about Emma and Jake, attending school events without my explicit permission, or engaging in any behavior designed to undermine my parental authority. Violation of the order would result in immediate arrest. Patricia's reaction was volcanic. She called my sister Lisa, screaming about legal persecution and demanding that family members support her against my vindictive attack. She contacted my workplace, claiming I was an unfit employee who neglected his children. She even called Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, insisting that the restraining order was proof of my mental instability. But Patricia had miscalculated the extent of community support I'd built over the past year. Mrs. Rodriguez calmly informed Patricia that she was prohibited from contacting school personnel and that any further communication would be reported to authorities. My supervisor at the hardware store, who knew me as a reliable employee and devoted father, dismissed Patricia's claims entirely. The single-parent support group rallied around my family immediately. Marcus Thompson started coordinating school pickup assistance. Janet Morrison organized meal deliveries for the week. Rob Martinez volunteered to document any violations of the restraining order. The community that Patricia had tried to turn against me became my strongest defense. Most importantly, Emma and Jake responded to Patricia's absence with visible relief. The tension that had become their normal state began dissolving within days. Emma started volunteering answers in class again. Jake's clingy behavior decreased dramatically. Both children began talking about home and school with a natural enthusiasm that had been dampened by months of conflicting adult messages. "Dottie," Emma said one evening as we worked on her homework, "I don't feel scared about getting things wrong anymore." The change in Jake was even more dramatic. He stopped asking for constant reassurance about rules and expectations. He began playing more freely, laughing more readily, and engaging with other children without the anxiety that had characterized his behavior during Patricia's escalating campaign. But Patricia wasn't finished. Unable to contact me directly, she began working through intermediaries. She convinced Jessica's aunt to call me, claiming that the restraining order was destroying the family, and that I was keeping the children from their grandmother out of spite. "Patricia just wants to help," Aunt Marie told me during an uncomfortable phone conversation. "She's worried about Emma and Jake, and she feels like you're overreacting to normal grandparent concern." I realized that Patricia had been sharing her version of events with extended family members, painting herself as a victim of my vindictive behavior rather than the architect of a 3-year manipulation campaign. She'd carefully omitted the email evidence, the documented surveillance, and the systematic attempts to undermine my parenting. Aunt Marie, I said calmly, Patricia was planning to take my children away from me based on false allegations. The court reviewed the evidence and found her behavior threatening enough to warrant legal protection. This isn't about grandparent visits, this is about protecting Emma and Jake from ongoing manipulation. The conversation ended uncomfortably, but I realized that Patricia's campaign had extended far beyond my immediate family. She'd been building a network of supporters. Based on her carefully crafted narrative of concerned grandmother versus inadequate father, the legal reckoning came during the restraining order hearing, where Patricia had the opportunity to contest the restrictions. She arrived with her own attorney, prepared to argue that my action was excessive and that her behavior had been misinterpreted. Patricia's attorney presented her as a devoted grandmother concerned about her grandchildren's welfare. He argued that her frequent visits and school involvement were signs of caring, not harassment. He suggested that my restraining order was an overreaction motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine safety concerns. But Sarah Mitchell was prepared with comprehensive evidence. She presented the email chain documenting Patricia's conspiracy with Jessica. She shared the school counselor's notes about the children's stress and confusion. She showed security camera footage of Patricia's surveillance behavior. She provided witness statements from school personnel, other parents, and childcare providers about Patricia's inappropriate interference. The judge reviewed the evidence methodically. Patricia's emails, where she discussed creating situations to demonstrate my inadequacy and planning to file false CPS reports, were particularly damning. Her documented surveillance, her attempts to interrogate babysitters, and her public confrontations painted a clear picture of harassment rather than grandparent concern. Mrs. Patricia, the judge said, after reviewing all materials, your behavior as documented in these emails and witness statements goes far beyond appropriate grandparent involvement. Your systematic attempts to undermine Mr. Miller's parental authority and your stated plans to remove his children from his care based on fabricated evidence constitute a serious threat to family stability. The restraining order was made permanent, with provisions for supervised visitation only if Patricia completed counseling and demonstrated respect for my parental authority. The judge also ordered Patricia to pay my legal fees, acknowledging that her behavior had forced me to seek expensive legal protection. As we left the courthouse, Patricia looked stunned. For 3 years, she'd operated under the assumption that her authority as grandmother gave her the right to control my family's decisions. The legal system had definitively rejected that assumption, confirming that my role as custodial parent superseded her desire for control. But the real reckoning wasn't legal, it was personal. That evening, as Emma and Jake played happily in our backyard without the tension that had defined our family life for so long, I realized that Patricia's manipulation had failed completely. Her attempts to prove I was an inadequate father had instead demonstrated my competence, my community engagement, and my children's genuine happiness under my care. The woman who'd spent 3 years trying to take my children away from me had ultimately strengthened our family bonds and confirmed our resilience. The reckoning had revealed the truth that Emma and Jake had known all along: we were exactly where we belonged. Exactly as we were. The family rules contract was written on bright yellow paper and signed by all 3 of us with different colored markers. Emma chose purple for her signature, Jake picked green, and I used blue. It wasn't a legal document, but it represented something more important: our family's commitment to healthy boundaries and mutual respect. Rule number 1. Emma read aloud from our kitchen table where the contract was taped. We treat each other with kindness and respect, even when we disagree. The contract had been Jake's idea, inspired by a classroom activity about family cooperation. We should write down the rules so everyone remembers, he'd said during one of our evening conversations about the changes in our lives. Creating the contract together had been therapeutic for all of us. For months, Emma and Jake had been receiving conflicting messages about family rules and expectations. Patricia's criticism had made them question which behaviors were acceptable and which adults had authority to set standards. Rule number 2, Jake continued, Daddy makes the decisions about our family, but we can always share our feelings and ideas. This rule addressed the confusion that Patricia's interference had created. Both children needed clarity about who was in charge of our household and whose opinions mattered for family decisions, but they also needed to know that their voices were valued and heard. The weeks following the restraining order had been a period of healing and adjustment. Without Patricia's constant criticism and manipulation, our family dynamics began returning to their natural rhythm. Emma's confidence bloomed as she stopped second-guessing her homework and projects. Jake's anxiety decreased as he learned to trust that our family rules were consistent and fair. Rule number 3, I read. We talk about our feelings when something is bothering us. This rule reflected one of the most important lessons we'd learned. Patricia's manipulation had thrived in an environment where concerns weren't directly addressed. Emma and Jake had absorbed criticism and confusion without having a safe space to process their feelings. Now we held regular family meetings where everyone could share their thoughts and emotions. Mrs. Washington, The school counselor had been instrumental in helping the children understand the changes in our family situation. She'd worked with Emma and Jake to process their confusion about the conflicting messages they'd received about their father's competence. Sometimes adults disagree about what's best for children, she'd explained to them. But your daddy is the person responsible for taking care of you, and he's doing an excellent job. The counseling sessions had helped both children articulate their feelings about Patricia's behavior without feeling guilty for preferring their father's parenting style. Emma had admitted feeling scared to be wrong when Patricia was around. Jake had shared that he felt safer when it was just the three of us. Rule number 4, Emma continued, we support each other and work as a team. Our support network had expanded since the legal resolution. The single-parent group had become like extended family, providing both practical help and emotional support. Emma and Jake had developed friendships with other children from single-parent families, normalizing their family structure in a way that helped them feel confident about our situation. Marcus Thompson's daughter Sophia had become Emma's closest friend, and their sleepovers at our house were filled with laughter and imagination. Jake had bonded with Rob Martinez's twin boys, and their weekend adventures had given Jake positive male role models beyond just his father. Rule number 5. Jake read carefully. We're proud of our family just the way it is. This rule addressed the self-doubt that Patricia's criticism had planted for months. All three of us had questioned whether our family was good enough compared to traditional two-parent households. The contract affirmed that our family structure was complete and valuable exactly as it was. The PTA presidency had continued to provide me with confidence and community recognition. The Family Support Fund had helped 12 families during the school year, and the inclusive programming had increased parent participation by 40%. My leadership had proven that single parents weren't just surviving, we were contributing meaningfully to our communities. Rule number 6, I concluded. We make decisions based on love, respect, and what's best for our family. This final rule represented our commitment to prioritizing our family's actual needs over outside pressure or criticism. We'd learned that other people's opinions about our family weren't as important as our own experience of love, stability, and mutual support. The contract also included specific provisions about visits from extended family members. Any adult wanting to spend time with Emma and Jake needed to respect my parental authority, support our family rules, and contribute positively to the children's emotional well-being. What if Grandma Patricia wants to visit someday? Emma had asked during our contract discussion. If she learns to follow our family rules and treats everyone with respect, we can talk about supervised visits, I'd explained, but only if those visits make you feel safe and happy. Both children had nodded solemnly, understanding that their emotional well-being was the priority. They'd learned that love and care should feel supportive, not stressful or confusing. The weeks passed peacefully. Emma's grades improved even further as her confidence stabilized. Jake started kindergarten soccer and threw himself into the activity. With enthusiasm, both children talked about our family with pride, describing our traditions and routines to their friends with obvious affection. Most importantly, the constant tension that had characterized our home life for 3 years finally dissipated. We could plan activities without worrying about unexpected criticism. We could make parenting decisions without second-guessing ourselves. We could simply be a family without constantly defending our choices. The yellow contract remained on our kitchen table, a visible reminder of the boundaries we'd established and the values we shared. It represented our transition from a family under siege to a family at peace with itself. Rule number 7, Jake added one evening, writing carefully, with his green marker, "We're the best family ever." Emma and I signed the addition immediately. It was the truest rule of all. The thank you card arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, handwritten on behalf of the entire PTA membership. Dear David, it read, your leadership this year has transformed our school community. You've shown us what inclusive, practical leadership looks like, and our children are better for it. Thank you for proving that the best leaders are those who understand the real challenges families face. Sitting in my car outside the post office, reading those words, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 18 months ago, I'd been the overwhelmed single father who felt like an outsider at school events. Now I was finishing a successful term as PTA president, with a waiting list of parents eager to join our committees, and a model that other schools were asking to replicate. But more importantly, Emma and Jake were thriving. Emma, now 9, had developed into a confident, compassionate child who helped younger students with their reading and stood up for classmates who needed support. Jake, at 7, had found his voice in kindergarten soccer and art class, expressing himself with creativity and joy that seemed to grow stronger every day. The transformation hadn't been dramatic, it had been gradual, like watching flowers grow. After a long winter, without the constant undercurrent of criticism and manipulation, our family had flourished in ways I'd never imagined possible. Daddy, Emma said that evening as we worked on her science project about plant growth, remember, when you were scared to talk at PTA meetings? I laughed, thinking about that nervous father who'd stood in the back of the cafeteria taking notes. I remember feeling like I didn't belong there. But you did belong. Jake chimed in from where he was coloring at the kitchen table. You belonged, because you cared about us. Their perspective helped me understand something I'd missed during the difficult years. Patricia's criticism hadn't been about my actual parenting. It had been about her need to maintain control over a family that was functioning well without her input. My involvement in their education, my attention to their emotional needs, my commitment to their well-being had all been threats to her assumed authority. The legal resolution had brought unexpected peace. Patricia, bound by the restraining order and court-mandated counseling, had stopped her campaign of interference. Extended family members who'd initially supported her narrative had gradually learned the truth about her manipulation and conspiracy. Some relationships had been permanently damaged, but the relationships that mattered with Emma and Jake had grown stronger. Jessica had continued her own journey of healing in California. She'd sent the children birthday cards and had started participating in brief video calls supervised by a family therapist. The children were gradually rebuilding a relationship with their mother, but on terms that prioritized their emotional safety and my role as their primary parent. I'm sorry I hurt you and the children, Jessica had written in a letter to me. I see now that I let Mom control my decisions instead of trusting my own judgment. You're an amazing father, and I should have supported you instead of doubting you. The apology had been meaningful, but the children's healing hadn't depended on their mother's acknowledgement. They'd learned to trust their own experience of love and security with me. Regardless of other adults' opinions about our family, the single-parent support group had evolved into lasting friendships. Marcus, Janet, Rob, and I met monthly, not just to share childcare duties and practical advice, but to celebrate our children's accomplishments and our own growth as parents. We'd all learned that single parenthood wasn't a deficit to overcome, it was a different path to the same destination. Raising happy, healthy, confident children. You know what I've realized? Marcus had said during our last coffee meeting. We've been so focused on proving we're good enough that we forgot to notice we're actually excellent at this. My work life had stabilized as well. The skills I'd developed through PTA leadership had translated into workplace opportunities. Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, had promoted me to assistant manager, recognizing my organizational abilities and customer service skills. The job came with better hours, increased pay, and the flexibility to maintain my involvement in Emma and Jake's education. Your kids are lucky to have you, Mrs. Rodriguez had told me during our final parent-teacher conference of the year. Emma talks about your family with such pride. She knows she's loved, supported, and valued. That's the foundation every child needs. As I tucked Emma and Jake into bed that Tuesday night, I realized how far we'd all traveled from the scared, defensive family we'd been during Patricia's campaign of manipulation. The children fell asleep easily, secure in routines that felt stable and predictable. There were no more requests for reassurance about whether Daddy was doing things right. No more anxiety about conflicting adult expectations. Daddy, Emma whispered as I turned off her light, I'm glad our family is exactly the way it is. Me too, sweetheart, I whispered back. Me too. The thank you card was now taped to our refrigerator, next to Emma's latest art project and Jake's soccer schedule. It served as a reminder not of my transformation from clueless to competent, but of the truth that had been there all along. I'd always been exactly the father my children needed. Patricia's criticism had been designed to make me doubt my abilities and question my worth as a parent. Instead, it had forced me to examine my values, strengthen my skills, and build a community of support that enriched all our lives. The documentation notebook that had once recorded moments of doubt and defensive responses now contained entries about Emma's academic achievements, Jake's growing confidence, and our family's adventures. The same careful attention to detail that had helped me build a legal case against Patricia's manipulation now helped me track the children's growth and celebrate their milestones. June 15th, I wrote in my current entry, Emma won the school's citizenship award for helping other students. Jake scored his first soccer goal and insisted we call Marcus to share the news. Both children talked about next year's plans with excitement and confidence. Our family continues to grow stronger. The PTA presidency had taught me that leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about asking the right questions and creating space for others to contribute their strengths. Parenting, I'd learned, operated on the same principle. I didn't need to be perfect, I needed to be present, engaged, and willing to adapt as Emma and Jake grew and changed. 6 months later, I received an unexpected call. Patricia had completed her court-mandated counseling and was requesting supervised visitation with Emma and Jake. Her therapist indicated that she'd made significant progress in understanding appropriate boundaries and had acknowledged the harm her behavior had caused. It's entirely your decision, Sarah Mitchell told me during our consultation. The restraining order allows for supervised visits if you determine they'd be in the children's best interest. Emma and Jake, now comfortable enough to express their feelings freely, had mixed reactions to the possibility. Emma was curious about seeing her grandmother, but firm about maintaining our family rules. Jake was more hesitant, remembering the anxiety that Patricia's visits had created. We can try one visit and see how it feels, Emma suggested with the wisdom of a child who'd learned to trust her own emotional responses. The supervised visit took place at a family counseling center, with a professional mediator present. Patricia appeared subdued and respectful, following the guidelines about supportive interaction without criticism. She asked about the children's interests and activities without questioning my decisions or offering unsolicited advice. "Your father tells me you're doing well in school," she said to Emma, her tone careful and measured. "I'm proud of your hard work." The visit was pleasant but not transformative. Emma and Jake interacted politely with their grandmother, but without the natural warmth they showed with other supportive adults in their lives. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent behavior to rebuild. "How did that feel?" I asked. The children afterward. "It was okay," Emma said thoughtfully. "She was nicer than before, but it still felt kind of weird." Jake nodded. "I like our family better when it's just us and our friends." We agreed to occasional supervised visits, but with clear understanding that Patricia's presence in our lives would be limited and conditional on her continued respect for our family's autonomy. Looking back on the 4 years since Jessica left, I could see the arc of our journey clearly. We'd moved from crisis to stability, from isolation to community, from defense to confidence. The single father who'd once felt clueless had become a respected community leader and, more importantly, a confident parent who trusted his instincts and valued his children's perspectives. The thank you card on our refrigerator had faded slightly, but its message remained true. I had transformed our school community by understanding real family challenges. But the greater transformation had been personal, learning that love, consistency, and genuine engagement were the only qualifications that mattered for good parenting. Emma and Jake were growing into remarkable young people, not despite our family structure, but because of the strength, resilience, and authenticity that our journey had developed. They'd learned to value substance over appearance, to trust their own feelings over others' judgments, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear or obligation. As we sat around our kitchen table that evening, working on homework and sharing stories from our day, I realized that Patricia's attempt to prove I was clueless about parenting had accomplished something she'd never intended. It had forced me to become not just a good father, but an exceptional one. The yellow family contract still hung on our wall, signed in purple, green, and blue markers. Rule number 7 remained our favorite: we're the best family ever, and we absolutely were.